It's been almost 100 years now since the lakes and rivers last echoed with the songs of the voyageurs. Gone are the 40-foot canoes of birch bark, but the art of paddling is still very much alive. The canoe is no longer a vehicle of trade and commerce. It has become instead the means of exploring or rediscovering what is left of the natural world. You won't find many people traveling alone nowadays. The lone trapper or prospector has given way to the pleasure canoeist, paddling double or in groups for companionship and safety. But learning to paddle solo is still fundamental to the art of canoeing. Paddling positions vary with wind, waves, and rapids. The most stable position is kneeling amidships, braced against the bow seat. By sliding over to the gunwale into the cruising position, paddling is made easier. But the wide kneel is safest in waves and rapids. For long distances, though, the cruising position is much more relaxing. To rest the legs, alternate one leg out. And there's nothing wrong with sitting on the seat for relaxation. Sitting on the heels in the center of the canoe is painful until you get used to it, but provides maximum control. The pivot point of the canoe is located directly beneath the canoeist. Kneeling amidships makes it possible to control the canoe with either bow or stern strokes. A turning stroke should be applied as far forward or back from the pivot point as possible. The most difficult thing about paddling is to make the canoe go in a straight line. A forward stroke causes the canoe to veer away from the paddling side. To compensate, most people change sides every few strokes. The canoe can be more easily steered by doing a pry at the end of each stroke. Most people turn the paddle in towards the canoe and pry away. It's been nicknamed the Goon Stroke. For flatwater paddling, there are 4 ways to do it better. First, the J stroke. The power face of the paddle, which is the side that pulls against the water, turns out away from the canoe. The path of the paddle describes a J. The difference is very subtle. Here it is again. The Goon Stroke. The power face of the paddle turns in. The J stroke. The power face turns out, away from the canoe. The thumb on the upper hand turns down if you're doing it right. The paddle is rotated freely in the lower hand. Paddling is made easier by sitting close to the gunwale, and the steering is more effective if the paddle is pried off the gunwale. To turn towards the paddle side, increase the pryaway at the stern and hold the paddle in the water longer. With the J, steering takes place at the end of the stroke. Now try knifing the paddle forward underwater during the recovery. Steering is accomplished by pulling up on the blade. Steering takes place during the recovery. It's called the Canadian stroke. It's harder to learn, but a relaxing and beautiful stroke. To make a turn towards the paddling side, angle the paddle deeper in the water and pull up harder during recovery. As with the J stroke, the paddle can be pried off the gunwale, or it can be done without touching the gunwale. Now try turning the paddle early in the forward stroke and continue the rolling action throughout. It's called the pitch because of the angling of the blade throughout the power stroke. By pitching the blade early, steering is accomplished during the power stroke. With just the right amount of pitch, the canoe will follow a dead straight course with very little effort wasted in steering. It's a fast, efficient stroke, but not as relaxing as the Canadian. Now try knifing the blade forward underwater and rotate the paddle in the upper hand to begin the next power stroke. The paddle remains in the water and makes one revolution per stroke, and steering takes place during the entire stroke. It's called the Indian stroke. If done slowly and carefully, there is no sound from the paddle. By drawing in as the paddle comes around to the bow, you can make a powerful inside turn. Once again, the 4 strokes. The J stroke. Steering is accomplished at the end of the stroke. The Canadian. Steering is accomplished during the recovery. The pitch. Steering is accomplished during the power stroke. The Indian stroke. Steering can be accomplished during the entire stroke. To turn away from the paddle side, just do a power stroke. To turn sharper, sweep the paddle wide to increase the arc of the blade from the pivot point. To turn even more violently, jam the paddle in at the bow at an angle. Sliding the lower hand up the shaft increases the reach, making pries, draws, and sweeps more effective. The bow jam, followed by a series of pries, will pivot the canoe on the spot. Using one hand is also effective, and it adds a little class to the maneuver. The pivot can be continued by knifing the paddle to the stern and drawing in. Then pry out at the bow and in at the stern. The paddle remains parallel to the canoe and describes a rectangle. It's called the box stroke. To pivot in the opposite direction, the stroke is reversed by drawing in at the bow and prying out at the stern. Now smooth the stroke out into one graceful motion and lean the canoe right to the gunwale. The cross draw is sometimes preferable to the bow pry for turning away from the paddle side. The cross draw can be followed by a power sweep. When underway, the momentum of the canoe increases the turning effect. But the degree of difficulty also increases. For a power turn to the paddle side, do an Indian stroke with strong emphasis on the draw in at the bow. The canoe responds quicker to bow strokes than stern because the bow rides higher. Power turns can be used for landing on difficult shorelines. The bow pry, followed by a stern draw. For running rapids, turns and pivots are often replaced by a side-slipping motion. Reach out at a 90-degree angle from the canoe and pull the paddle directly towards the body. For an underwater recovery, the paddle can be sliced away from the canoe. The draw is a good stroke, but the sculling draw is better. Knife the paddle back and forth, angled against the water. The path of the paddle resembles a figure of 8. The sculling draw is an effective and powerful stroke for side-slipping in rapids. To side-slip the canoe away from the paddle side, pry off the gunwale. The pry must be done right beside the body or the canoe will turn. Reverse sculling accomplishes the same thing. It's similar to the sculling draw, but the angle of the paddle is reversed. The paddle is high to reveal the angle of the blade. but the stroke should be done deep in the water. Draws and pries done under power increase the effectiveness of the strokes. To side slip towards the paddle side, hold the paddle at a 45-degree angle. As momentum slows, begin the scull draw to continue the side slipping. To side slip away from the paddle side, hold the pry at the opposite angle. As momentum slows, begin the pry strokes. The angle of the blade is controlled by the upper hand. Side slipping avoids the possibility of broadsiding onto a rock in rapids. To make the canoe go backward under control, draw in at the stern and roll the power face out. It's a reverse J. The power face turns out. For moving slowly in rapids, backsculling is used because of the stability gained by leaning the weight on the paddle. The strokes can be put together in various combinations to maintain control in wind and rapids. A strong draw in at the bow, a power stroke with a heavy J, and an underwater recovery will pull the canoe around into an inside turn, regardless of how strong the wind is blowing. A gust of wind hits the bow. A strong draw counteracts. The stroke propels the canoe forward, and a heavy J continues the turn into the wind. The upper hand rotates on the grip. The paddle knifes forward, holding the canoe on course despite the wind. The most effective stroke for turning the canoe around into the wind is the bow pry, or bow jam. Because of the mechanical advantage of the pry, the canoe can be levered around into the strongest of winds. Paddling on the lee side of the canoe this time, the bow jam holds the canoe from being blown downwind. A series of bow pries levers the bow around into the wind and holds steady. The canoe is like a weather vane. The high end will always swing downwind. By sitting ahead of the center thwart, the stern rides high and blows downwind, making it possible to hold the bow into the wind. When traveling with a load, position it as close to the center as possible. Keeping the bow and stern light and buoyant avoids the problem of waves breaking over the bow and stern. The gear is stowed forward in the bow, and the canoeist kneels in the stern when traveling in a light wind. A very comfortable position when traveling solo with a load. Wilderness canoeing is a creative art. The paddling positions and endless combinations of strokes harmonize with the ever-changing moods. Another skill demanded of the wild river canoeist is the ability to predict the degree of difficulty of a rapid. By studying the surface from shore, the canoeist can tell where the rocks are and if there is a navigable channel through them. It's called reading the rapids, a subject that will be dealt with in the next film. First, the strokes must be mastered, along with an understanding of how to use them in rapids. The backwater makes possible a slow descent of the rapids without turning broadside. It buys time to choose a course and position the canoe. The sculling draw side slips the canoe across the current towards the paddle side. The pry stroke side slips the canoe away from the paddle side. Side-slipping gets you to shore without turning broadside to the current. Comes in handy when you don't like what you see up ahead. The Indian stroke maintains control with a constant racing effect. Leaning Bowdraw turn, a powerful maneuver to pull the canoe out of the mainstream into an eddy. The crossbow not only turns the canoe away from the paddle side, but also slows the forward momentum of the canoe. The flat brace. By leaning the weight out on the blade, the effective width of the canoe increases from 3 feet to 6 feet because the paddle acts as an outrigger. The stabilizing effect can keep the canoe upright through extremely difficult water. The success of the brace depends on transferring your weight out onto the paddle. The high brace, the most stable position for difficult rapids. A canoeist traveling a wild river requires all the strokes, regardless of whether rapids are run or portaged. The approach to the portage can be extremely dangerous and demands considerable skill in making a controlled landing. Every year, canoeists are killed by being swept over falls or into rapids they had no intention of running. Just downstream from here, a man drowned. He drowned because he missed the landing. The power of falling water can be terrifying, but the rapids and falls of the Precambrian Shield are the essence of wilderness, the life and spirit of the land. No craft ever designed was better suited for this vast network of waterways, and no art more demanding than the art of paddling a canoe in wind, waves, and rapids.